The Frontier Line office had become too small. Papers covered every surface. New route schedules were pinned to the walls, and the large map of the frontier was now covered in markers showing delivery times, horse rotations, and supply caches. Wyatt stood at the center of it all, arms crossed, looking down at the thick ledger Kane had placed in front of him. "We're growing too fast," Kane said, his ears twitching with clear stress. "Mail volume has increased by more than half on both routes. We've hired 3 new riders, but we're still stretching ourselves thin. The horses are being worked too hard, and we're running low on quality tack and feed." Brock leaned against the wall, his massive arms folded. "People are starting to depend on us. Merchants, banks, even some city officials. They all want their important documents carried by the blue ribbon now." Wyatt flipped through the ledger, his face serious. "That kind of success draws attention. I received word this morning that the Iron Road Stagecoach Company is expanding rapidly. They've ordered a dozen new stagecoaches and are bidding on several major mail contracts between Eastmere and Michigan." Rhett, who had been spinning a coin on the table, looked up with a grin. "Stagecoaches? Those slow, heavy things? They'll never beat us." "They don't have to beat us in speed," Wyatt replied. "They can carry 10 times the cargo and offer armed escorts. If they start winning the big contracts, we could lose a lot of our steady business." The room grew a little quieter. Neera stepped forward, her voice calm and thoughtful. "Then we must decide what kind of company we want to be. Do we try to match their scale, or do we focus on what makes us different?" Raven, leaning against the back wall, spoke up. "Speed, trust, and one rider who can go where wagons can't." Wyatt closed the ledger with a solid thud. "We'll figure out our next move tomorrow. For tonight—" He looked around at his team. "We've earned a drink. Everyone's going to the Wyvern's Rest. First round is on me." Rhett immediately threw both fists in the air and let out a loud victory shout. The Wyvern's Rest was packed. The large 2-story tavern sat in the heart of Central City and had quickly become the favorite gathering place for riders, mercenaries, merchants, and off-duty guards. A massive hearth roared in the center of the room, and long wooden tables were filled with loud conversation and laughter. The moment the Frontier Line team walked through the doors, a booming voice rang out from behind the bar. "By my grandfather's flaming beard, if it isn't my favorite pack of troublemakers!" Thrain Ironbelly Stonefist grinned widely from behind the bar. The burly dwarf's thick black beard was braided with iron rings that clinked when he moved. His massive arms were covered in old burned scars, and he looked like he could wrestle a bear and win. "Wyatt, you cheap bastard!" Thrain bellowed, slamming a mug down on the bar. "You finally brought the whole crew! I was starting to think you were ashamed of me." Wyatt actually cracked a small smile. "You know I only come here when I can afford your robbery prices, Thrain." The dwarf laughed so hard the tankards on the shelves rattled. Sit down. The usual table in the back is open. First round really is on you, Wyatt?" "Unfortunately," Wyatt sighed. Thrain's grin grew even wider. "Then I'll make sure it's a round you'll remember." Neera and Raven took seats on one side of the long table, while Brock and Kane sat across from them. Rhett, of course, made a beeline straight for the bar to help Thrain bring the drinks. As the team settled in, the fire crackling warmly beside them, the tension from the office slowly began to melt away. For the first time in weeks, they weren't riders, leaders, or logisticians. They were just a crew, gathered together, ready to celebrate how far they'd come. The long table in the back corner of the Wyvern's Rest was alive with warmth and conversation. Thrain personally brought over the first round, carrying a heavy tray with surprising grace for such a big dwarf. He slammed the drinks down with theatrical flair. "All right, you sorry lot, listen up," he bellowed. "We've got a fine dark ale for Brock and Kane, a crisp golden wheat beer for the ladies, and—" He slid a glass of amber liquid in front of Wyatt with a knowing grin. Your usual poison, Wyatt. Straight rye whiskey. Neat." Wyatt gave a small nod of appreciation and took a slow sip, his shoulders visibly relaxing as the warmth hit him. Raven picked up her tankard of wheat beer, eyeing the foamy head with mild suspicion before taking a cautious sip. Her green eyes widened slightly. "This is actually good," she admitted, sounding almost surprised. Nira smiled elegantly beside her, gracefully sipping her own beer. The Wyvern's Rest has always had excellent taste in ale. Thrain takes great pride in his selection. Brock took a long, deep pull from his tankard, letting out a satisfied sigh as he wiped foam from his beard. "Nothing beats cold ale after a long week," he rumbled happily. Kane, ever the careful one, took small, measured sips of his dark ale, though even he couldn't hide the small smile forming on his face. His ears were relaxed, no longer pinned back with stress. Rhett, naturally, had already finished half his tankard and was waving it around as he spoke. "I'm telling you, we should start a betting pool on who can ride the full route the fastest in winter. I'd put money on myself, obviously." "You'd lose," Raven said flatly, earning a loud laugh from Brock. Wyatt sat back in his chair, quietly observing his team with a rare look of contentment. His whiskey glass was already half empty. For a while, the conversation flowed easily. Stories from the road, complaints about difficult customers, and light teasing between the group. The tension from the office earlier in the day slowly faded with every sip of ale. Raven eventually leaned toward Nira, lowering her voice slightly. "I still don't understand why people enjoy sitting in loud places like this." Nira tilted her head, her blonde hair catching the firelight beautifully. "It's not about the noise," she said gently. "It's about being together. After everything we've built, we've earned the right to enjoy each other's company." Raven glanced around the table, at Wyatt's quiet strength, Brock's booming laugh, Kane's soft smile, and Rhett's wild energy. She took another sip of her beer. "Maybe you're right." Wyatt raised his glass slightly. "To the frontier line," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the table. The rest of the team raised their tankards in response. "To the frontier line." Even Kane joined in enthusiastically, his usual caution loosened by both the ale and the warmth of the company. As the night grew later and the fire burned brighter, the first round slowly turned into a second. The laughter grew louder, the stories grew taller, and Rhett was just getting started. The second round arrived with even more enthusiasm than the first. Thrain personally delivered the tray again, this time with a wicked grin on his face. "Second round's on the house for my favorite blue ribbon idiots," the dwarf roared. "But only because I like watching you all make terrible decisions." Rhett immediately snatched up his tankard and took a long swig before slamming it down. "Now we're talking," he declared, his energy already rising. "This is what I've been waiting for all week." Across the table, Raven was starting to loosen up. The wheat beer had warmed her blood, and her usual guarded expression had softened. She leaned back in her chair, one arm draped casually over the backrest, watching Rhett with an unreadable look. "You're loud even when you're sober," she said. "I can't imagine how unbearable you're going to be by the end of the night." Rhett turned to her with that signature cocky grin, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Careful, wild one. Keep looking at me like that, and people are going to start thinking you like the noise." Raven's lips curved into a dangerous little smirk. "And what if I do?" The table went quiet for half a second. Rhett blinked, clearly caught off guard by her direct response. For once, the quick-tongued gunslinger didn't have an immediate comeback. He just stared at her, his grin slowly turning into something more intrigued. Nira, sitting beside Raven, noticed the exchange and hid a small smile behind her tankard. Meanwhile, Brock had just finished his second ale and let out a deep, contented sigh. "Nothing beats good ale and good company," he said warmly, completely oblivious to the way Nira's gaze kept drifting toward him. Nira watched the big man with quiet affection, the way the firelight played across his broad shoulders, the easy smile he wore when he was relaxed. She found it strangely captivating. She leaned forward slightly. "You seem more at peace here than you do on the road, Brock," she said softly, her voice like velvet. Brock turned to her with his usual friendly, open expression. "Well, sure. No saddle sores, no freezing wind, and the company's a lot prettier than a bunch of angry bandits." He laughed, completely missing the compliment hidden in her words. Nira's silver eyes flickered with amusement. She opened her mouth to say something else, but Kane cut in, raising his tankard. "To surviving another month," he said, his voice slightly looser than usual. Everyone raised their drinks again. As they clinked their tankards together, Rhett's eyes kept flicking back to Raven, and Nira's gaze continued to linger on Brock just a little longer than necessary. The night was still young. By the time the third round arrived, the atmosphere at the table had shifted. This time, Thrain didn't just bring ale, he brought whiskey. A bottle of strong amber liquid was placed in the center of the table, along with fresh glasses. "All right," the dwarf declared. "You've had your warm-up. Now it's time to drink like real riders." Rhett's eyes lit up like a kid on his birthday. "Now we're talking." He reached for the bottle immediately, pouring generous amounts into each glass before anyone could protest. When he slid a glass toward Raven, she didn't hesitate. She picked it up and met his gaze boldly. Rhett raised his glass toward her, his voice lower than usual. "To unexpected answers," he said, clearly still thinking about her earlier comment. Raven clinked her glass against his, never breaking eye contact. "To loud idiots who somehow survive," she replied. They both drank. Brock, meanwhile, took his whiskey like a champion, then turned to Nira with a big, friendly smile. "You sure you want to drink that, Nira? It's pretty strong stuff." Nira smiled gently at him, her expression warm and patient. "I'll be fine, Brock, but thank you for worrying about me." Brock nodded earnestly, completely missing the fond look in her eyes. "Yeah, of course. Can't have our best diplomat getting drunk and starting diplomatic incidents." Kane nearly choked on his whiskey laughing. The whiskey was doing its job. Tongues were loosening, eyes were lingering, and Rhett was only just getting started. The whiskey was hitting hard. What started as polite sipping quickly turned into full glasses being poured and drained. The once relatively composed table had descended into loud laughter, overlapping conversations, and flushed faces. Rhett was already on his third glass of whiskey, and the effect was immediate. His usual cocky energy had been dialed up to dangerous levels. He had pushed his chair back and was now leaning heavily on the table, grinning like a madman. "You know what I love about you, Raven," he said, pointing a slightly unsteady finger at her. "You don't take anyone's shit, not even mine. That's rare." Raven was clearly feeling the whiskey, too. Her cheeks had a faint flush, and her silver hair had become slightly messy. She was leaning forward, elbows on the table, staring at Rhett with a dangerous, playful glint in her green eyes. "Is that your way of saying you like me, gunslinger?" she asked, her voice low and teasing. The entire table suddenly got a lot quieter again. Rhett didn't back down. He leaned in closer, matching her intensity. "Maybe it is." For a moment, the two of them just stared at each other, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. On the other side of the table, Brock was on his fourth drink and had reached the affectionate drunk stage. His cheeks were bright red, and he had one massive arm draped over the back of Nira's chair. "Nira, you're so graceful," he slurred happily. Like a swan. Or a really fancy tree. Wait, that didn't sound right?" Nira, who was significantly more composed than the others but still clearly tipsy, rested her chin in her hand and looked at him with open fondness. "A fancy tree?" she asked, amused. "Yeah," Brock said, nodding vigorously. "You're tall and elegant, and everyone wants to look at you." Nira's lips curved into a soft smile. She gently placed her hand on his forearm. "You're very sweet when you're drunk, Brock." Brock blinked at her slowly. "You're pretty when I'm drunk, too." Kane, who had been trying to stay somewhat responsible, had completely failed. He was giggling into his glass, his ears flopped sideways, tail swishing lazily behind him. "You're all ridiculous," he mumbled happily. "Every single one of you." Rhett suddenly slammed his empty glass down on the table and stood up unsteadily, raising his arms like he was about to give a sermon. "Listen up!" he shouted, his voice carrying across half the tavern. "I've seen things. I know what's coming." Thrain the barkeep looked over from the bar with a grin, already knowing what was coming. "Oh, here we go." Rhett's eyes were wild and unfocused as he looked at his confused teammates. "Mark my words, one day we won't need horses. We're going to build giant iron horses that run on steel tracks. They'll scream across the land faster than any of us can ride. We're talking locomotives, baby." The table stared at him in dead silence. Raven slowly raised an eyebrow. "What the fuck is a locomotive?" Rhett was standing now, both hands planted on the table, eyes wide with drunken conviction. "No, no, no, listen," he insisted, his voice loud enough that people at nearby tables were starting to turn their heads. "I'm not talking about normal horses. I'm talking about iron horses. Big metal beasts that don't get tired. They don't need food, they don't need water, they just go." He made a wild sweeping motion with his arm. "They run on these long straight steel tracks that we lay across the entire land. From Central City all the way to Eastmere, to Nishigain, everywhere. And these iron horses will pull giant metal boxes full of people and cargo behind them." Brock was leaning forward, brow furrowed in deep concentration, trying his hardest to understand. "So, it's like a wagon?" he asked slowly. "But made of iron?" "Yes," Rhett shouted, pointing at him excitedly. "But way bigger and faster. These things will scream across the plains faster than any rider could ever dream." Kane's ears twitched as he tried to process the information, his drunk mind working overtime. "So, they're mechanical horses," he said carefully. "Do they run on steam, like those dwarven contraptions?" Rhett snapped his fingers and pointed at Kane. "Exactly! Steam, boiling water and fire and pressure. They'll make this loud whistling sound when they move. Choo-choo!" Raven stared at him, her head slightly tilted with her messy silver hair. "Choo-choo," she repeated deadpan. "Yes," Rhett said passionately. "Choo-fucking-choo!" Nira, who had been listening with elegant patience, finally spoke up, her voice soft but clearly confused. "So this iron horse, it runs on fire and water, on metal tracks, across the entire continent?" "Yes, exactly!" Rhett looked thrilled that someone was finally understanding him. "One day, you won't need to spend 8 days riding to Eastmere. You'll just sit in a comfortable chair and be there in hours." The table went quiet for a moment as everyone tried to picture it. Then Brock scratched his beard and frowned. "But where do the horses go?" Rhett threw his hands up in exasperation. "There are no horses. That's the whole point." Rhett was now in full prophet mode. He had climbed up onto his chair, eyes wild, gesturing with one hand while clutching the whiskey bottle with the other. His face was flushed, and his words were starting to slur together, but his conviction was stronger than ever. "And that's not even the craziest part," he shouted. "One day people are going to fly in giant metal birds. They'll have wings made of steel and engines louder than thunder." Kane blinked slowly, his tail hanging limply behind him. "Metal birds." "Yes," Rhett insisted, "and they'll carry hundreds of people through the sky." Nira, still trying to follow his drunken logic, tilted her head gracefully. "And how exactly does one tame a metal bird?" she asked, genuinely curious. Rhett opened his mouth, then paused. His brain clearly short-circuited for a moment. "You just build it," he muttered. Brock shook his head, laughing deeply. "Brother, I think you've had enough." "I'm not drunk," Rhett protested, nearly falling off his chair. "I'm a prophet, a whiskey prophet." Suddenly, his eyes lit up with a new burst of drunken inspiration. Wait, I can show you." He nearly fell off the chair as he lunged toward the bar, returning moments later with a crumpled napkin and a pencil Thrain had given him. He slammed them both onto the table and immediately began scribbling furiously. The rest of the team leaned in, watching with a mix of curiosity and amusement. Rhett's tongue was sticking out slightly in concentration as he drew. What came out were chaotic, barely legible scribbles, circles, lines, weird boxes with wheels, and something that might have been a bird or possibly a dragon with rectangles for wings. He kept muttering to himself while drawing, "See, this is the locomotive. Big boiler here. Wheels on steel tracks. And this is the metal bird. Wings go like this." He flipped the napkin over and kept scribbling even more frantically, his handwriting becoming completely unreadable. Raven stared at the napkin, then at Rhett, then back at the napkin. "Rhett, that's just a bunch of drunk lines." "No, it's genius," he slurred, pointing aggressively at his own scribbles. "This is the future. You're all just not evolved enough to understand it yet." Nira reached over and gently rotated the napkin, trying to make sense of it from a different angle. "Is this a horse with wheels?" "That's the locomotive," Rhett cried out in despair. Brock squinted hard at the drawing, his face serious. "I think I see a cow." "It's not a cow!" Kane, who had been quietly giggling for the past minute, finally lost it completely and burst out laughing, nearly falling off his chair. Raven sighed, grabbed the bottle of whiskey, and took a long pull from it. "All right, that's enough." She reached over, snatched the pencil out of Rhett's hand mid-scribble, and gave him a flat look. "Shut the fuck up, Rhett. You're not a prophet, you're just drunk." She slid the bottle across the table toward Brock. "Pass me the whiskey." The entire table erupted into loud, drunken laughter as Rhett dramatically clutched his chest like his heart had been broken, still trying to defend his napkin full of incoherent scribbles. The table absolutely tore into him. "Oh my God, look at this one," Raven said, holding up the crumpled napkin with 2 fingers like it was diseased. "Is this supposed to be a dragon, or did you just throw up on the paper?" "That's the locomotive," Rhett cried out, still standing on his chair. Kane, now completely red in the face from laughing, wiped tears from his eyes. "You drew a rectangle with wheels and called it the future. I've seen children's drawings that made more sense." Brock squinted at the napkin again, tilting his head. "I still think that's a cow." "It's not a fucking cow," Rhett shouted, throwing his hands up in drunken despair. Nira, ever the graceful one, gently patted Rhett's arm. "It's very imaginative," she offered kindly, though her blue eyes were sparkling with amusement. Thrain the barkeep was laughing so hard from behind the bar that he had to hold onto the counter to stay upright. The roasting continued for a long while. Every time Rhett tried to explain his visions of iron horses and flying machines, someone would cut him off with another joke or a new insult. Even quiet, reserved Kane joined in, making surprisingly savage comments between giggles. And yet, Rhett was smiling the entire time. He was laughing with them, taking every joke, every insult, every piece of mockery in stride, because deep down, he knew something they didn't. He was right. Every wild, drunken thing he was saying was real. He had lived in that world. He knew those machines existed. But watching his friends mock his crazy ideas while getting blackout drunk was far too entertaining to ruin with the truth. So he kept playing the fool. As the night wore on, the whiskey kept flowing. The laughter grew louder, the insults grew harsher, and one by one, the team began to crumble. Kane was the first to go. The poor catboy passed out with his head on the table, purring softly in his sleep, ears twitching occasionally. Nira followed not long after, gracefully resting her head on Brock's massive shoulder. Brock himself lasted a little longer, but eventually his head dropped forward with a heavy thump onto the table, snoring like a bear. Raven was the last to fall. She gave Rhett one final hazy smirk, muttered, "You're still an idiot," and then slumped sideways in her chair, silver hair covering half her face. Only Rhett remained conscious. Once he was sure everyone was truly out, he quietly reached under the table, pulled out his water skin, and took several long, deliberate sips of water. A small, knowing grin spread across his face. "Amateurs," he muttered affectionately, looking at his passed-out friends with genuine warmth. Thrain walked over, shaking his head with a chuckle. "Same trick as last time?" "Same trick as always," Rhett replied, raising his water skin in salute. "A man's got to have some secrets." The next morning was brutal. Sunlight stabbed through the windows of the Wyvern's Rest like daggers. Kane was groaning with his face pressed against the table, ears flattened. Brock was still snoring loudly. Nira had somehow maintained her grace even while unconscious, though her hair was a mess. Raven was slumped over, one arm hanging off her chair, looking like she wanted to murder the sun itself. Rhett, of course, looked perfectly fine. He sat at the end of the table, sipping water and looking annoyingly refreshed. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the crumpled napkin covered in his drunken scribbles. Sober now, he stared at it for a long moment, turning it left and right, trying to make sense of the chaotic lines, circles, and unreadable text. He narrowed his eyes. "What the fuck did I draw?" he muttered to himself. The wild, vivid visions of locomotives, steel tracks, and flying machines that had felt so clear last night were completely gone. The napkin was nothing but incoherent drunk scribbles. He couldn't make heads or tails of any of it. Rhett let out a quiet chuckle and shook his head, folding the napkin and tucking it back into his pocket. "Strange," he whispered with a small, private smile. He looked at his hungover, miserable friends and raised his cup of water in a silent toast. "Guess some things are only clear when you're drunk."
Putting on a show, solving world hunger on a cocktail napkin. Bar stool profit, nobody asking. Bartender nodding, heard it all before. Whiskey philosophy, walking out the door. Whiskey philosophy, bar stool profit, drunk genius talking. Stop it, whiskey philosophy. Profit. Grabbed a stranger, told him all my theories. Whiskey philosophy, clearing my queries. Politicians should be paid in minimum wage. Bar stool profit, prophet of the age. Bartender nodding, heard it all before. Whiskey philosophy, walking out the door. Whiskey philosophy, bar stool profit. philosophy. Profit. Napkin full of scribbled lines, whiskey, philosophy, reading the signs. Made no sense in daylight, pure gold at night. Bye.